My name is Arthur Sterling. I'm 55 years old, and until 3 months ago I was the creative director at Morrison & Associates, one of Portland's premier advertising agencies. 30 years I gave to that place. 30 years of building campaigns, nurturing talent, creating the institutional knowledge that made us who we were. Leo Vance was my greatest mistake. The signs were there from the beginning. How he cataloged every weakness, every vulnerability. Clara saw it after his first dinner. There's something hollow about him, like he's performing gratitude instead of feeling it. I dismissed her concerns. After 30 years at Morrison & Associates, I was lonely for a legacy. Someone who could carry forward everything I'd built. Leo seemed brilliant, respectful, hungry to learn. Your Cascade Electronics campaign wasn't about specs. It was about security, families, he said during his interview. That's anthropology. I hired him that afternoon. The first 3 years were perfect. Leo absorbed knowledge voraciously, made connections, led successful campaigns. His Meridian Corporation work positioned them as human stories rather than corporate messaging. Sales jumped 23%. He won awards, always sharing credit graciously. This is the future of advertising, Henderson told me. Leo brings fresh perspective. I felt pride, not jealousy. This was my legacy. Then the shifts began. Leo arrived earlier, had conversations that stopped when I appeared. He scheduled client calls during my meetings, briefed me less thoroughly. My file access required approval. Email chains forgot to include me. It's updating protocols, he'd explain. Everyone's having issues. But only I seemed affected. During meetings, my suggestions were acknowledged but rarely implemented. Leo redirected toward contemporary approaches for modern consumers. My 30 years became traditional methodologies needing evolution. I felt like a museum curator in my own department. Henderson began treating Leo as mentor rather than student, leaning forward with interest when Leo spoke, nodding politely at my presentations. Leo represented us at conferences I'd historically attended while I handled operational matters. Clara noticed my stress during our evening walks. "Is everything okay with Leo?" "Leo's doing excellent work," I replied, which was true. "He's exceeded every expectation. But something's bothering you about the situation." I couldn't articulate what was bothering me because it was nothing concrete, nothing I could point to as obviously problematic. Leo was performing brilliantly. Clients loved him. Henderson valued his contributions, and his innovative approaches were generating impressive results. If anything, I should have been celebrating his success as validation of my mentoring abilities. But there was something in the way he looked at me now during meetings. Not with the grateful respect of a student, but with the patient tolerance of someone humoring an elderly relative. Something in the way conversations shifted when I joined them, as if my presence required adjusting the discussion to accommodate my limitations. "Maybe I'm just having trouble adjusting to sharing leadership," I told Clara. "It's been my department for so long. Having an equal partner is taking some getting used to." But Leo wasn't my equal partner. Increasingly, he was becoming my superior, and everyone seemed to accept this transition as natural and inevitable. The promotion to Senior Creative Director came 6 months later, announced during the quarterly all-hands meeting. Henderson presented it as recognition for exceptional performance and strategic thinking. The applause was genuine. Leo was well-liked by most of the staff, charming and supportive to his subordinates while maintaining appropriate respect for senior leadership. What bothered me wasn't the promotion itself, but how it was framed. Henderson spoke about fresh perspectives and innovative approaches in ways that subtly implied the old perspectives and established approaches were holding us back. He talked about evolving our creative philosophy and embracing disruption with language that made my 30 years of proven success sound like institutional inertia. Leo's acceptance speech was masterful. He thanked me publicly for my mentorship, praised my contributions to the agency's success, and positioned himself as someone building on my foundation rather than replacing it. But his language was careful, strategic. He spoke about my legacy and foundational work in ways that made me sound historical rather than current. Arthur Sterling built the creative excellence this agency is known for, Leo said, gesturing toward me with apparent warmth. Now it's our job to take that excellence into the future. Our job. As if we were partners. But the power dynamics had shifted fundamentally, and everyone in the room understood that Leo was now the primary creative voice of Morrison and Associates. Within weeks of his promotion, Leo began implementing what he called optimization protocols. New approval processes that required his sign-off on projects I'd historically managed independently. Revised client communication procedures that positioned him as the primary point of contact for major accounts. Updated project management systems that gave him oversight of resource allocation and team assignments. It's about efficiency, he explained when I questioned the changes, making sure we're maximizing our collaborative potential and avoiding redundant efforts. But the real effect was to insert him into every significant decision I made, gradually reducing my autonomy while expanding his control. The most insidious part of Leo's strategy was how he managed my relationship with our biggest clients. Over the course of several months, he systematically repositioned himself as their primary contact while making it seem like a natural evolution of our service model. Arthur. The Cascade team mentioned they'd prefer to streamline communication, Leo would say after a client meeting. They'd like one primary point of contact for strategic decisions. Since you're so busy with the creative development, I offered to handle the account management side. Account management. As if 30 years of client relationships could be reduced to administrative coordination. What Leo understood, and what I was slow to recognize, was that clients don't just buy advertising services. They buy relationships. They want to work with people they trust, people who understand their business needs, people who make them feel confident about their marketing investments. By gradually inserting himself into every client interaction, Leo was transferring that trust and confidence from me to him. The process was so gradual that clients barely noticed it happening. One month I was leading strategy sessions with Leo providing support. The next month Leo was leading strategy sessions while I provided creative input. Within 6 months, clients were calling Leo directly for everything from minor revisions to major campaign overhauls. The Meridian team called this morning, Leo would mention casually. They want to discuss Q3 strategy. I scheduled a meeting for Thursday. I know you're tied up with the Henderson presentation. I wasn't tied up with the Henderson presentation. I could have easily attended the Meridian meeting. But Leo had created a narrative where my time was always committed to other priorities, making his availability seem more valuable and reliable. Henderson began noticing these dynamics during our monthly leadership reviews. Leo seems to have developed strong relationships with our key accounts, he observed. Clients specifically ask for him by name. Leo's very good with clients, I agreed, because it was true. He has a natural ability to understand their needs. That's exactly what we need as we grow. Client relationships are the foundation of our business, and Leo seems to understand that instinctively. Client relationships. The thing I'd spent 30 years building, now being credited to my protege as if he'd developed them independently. But the most troubling development wasn't Leo's growing influence with clients, or Henderson's increasing reliance on his strategic input. It was the way my own team was beginning to treat me differently. Junior staff members who'd once sought my approval for creative decisions were now checking with Leo first. Project managers were scheduling reviews based on Leo's availability rather than mine. Even my assistant Janet began filtering my calls and emails through Leo's priorities. Leo mentioned you're swamped with the Morrison campaign, Janet would say when I asked about missed meetings or delayed communications. He suggested I reschedule your Thursday appointments to give you more focused time. I wasn't swamped with the Morrison campaign. It was a routine project that required perhaps 10 hours of work spread across 3 weeks. But Leo had created the impression that I was overwhelmed, working at capacity, unable to handle additional responsibilities. The fiction of my limitations became accepted truth throughout the agency. Arthur Sterling was a valuable creative resource, but he was also older, slower, less adaptable to modern client demands. Leo Vance was young, energetic, innovative, the natural choice for handling growth opportunities and challenging accounts. Clara began pointing out changes in my behavior that I hadn't recognized myself. "You're coming home earlier lately," she observed one evening as I arrived at 5:30 instead of my usual 7 o'clock. "Are things slowing down at work?" "Not exactly slowing down, just different. Leo's handling more of the day-to-day management, which gives me more time to focus on creative development." "And you're happy with that arrangement?" I paused, considering her question. Was I happy? The reduced workload meant less stress, more time with Clara, more opportunity to focus on the aspects of advertising I enjoyed most. But it also meant less influence, less involvement in strategic decisions, less connection to the business I'd helped build. "I think it's probably good for the agency," I said finally. "Leo brings fresh energy and new perspectives. Clients respond well to him." "That's not what I asked. Are you happy with the arrangement?" I couldn't answer honestly because I didn't know the answer myself. The rational part of me recognized that organizational changes were natural as businesses grew and evolved. The emotional part of me felt like I was being gradually erased from a company I'd devoted my career to building. "I'm adjusting," I said finally. But adjustment implied that the changes were temporary, that I would eventually find my equilibrium in the new structure. What I was really doing was accepting a diminished role while Leo consolidated power behind a facade of collaborative leadership. The final phase of Leo's strategy began 8 months after his promotion to senior creative director. He started making subtle suggestions about succession planning and organizational continuity. "Arthur," he said during one of our weekly one-on-one meetings, "have you given any thought to your long-term plans? I know retirement isn't immediate, but it might be worth considering how we ensure smooth transitions when the time comes." Retirement. I was 55 years old, at the peak of my creative abilities, with at least 10 more productive years ahead of me. But Leo was already planning for my departure. "I'm not planning to retire anytime soon," I replied carefully. "Of course not. But the agency needs to think strategically about institutional knowledge transfer. Your experience and methodologies are invaluable, and we need to make sure they're preserved and passed along to the next generation of creative leadership." Institutional knowledge transfer, preserved and passed along. The language made me sound like a historical artifact whose primary value was educational. "What did you have in mind?" "Maybe a mentorship program where you work closely with junior staff to document your approaches and methodologies. Or perhaps a consulting role that gives you flexibility while ensuring the agency maintains access to your expertise." A consulting role. Not employment, not partnership. A contractual arrangement that could be terminated at will. Over the following weeks, Leo began floating similar conversations with Henderson and other senior staff. Arthur Sterling was a tremendous asset, but the agency needed to plan for the future. Perhaps a gradual transition that honored his contributions while developing the next generation of creative leadership. Henderson brought up the subject during my annual performance review. "Leo mentioned you might be interested in exploring some alternative arrangements," he said. "Something that gives you more flexibility while maintaining your connection to the agency." "Leo mentioned that? We haven't had any detailed discussions about alternative arrangements." "Well, perhaps it's worth considering. You've built something remarkable here, Arthur, but you're also in a position to choose how you want to spend the next phase of your career. Not everyone has that luxury. The luxury of being pushed aside. The luxury of being made irrelevant in the organization I'd helped create." "I'm happy with my current role," I said firmly. "I plan to continue contributing at the highest level for years to come." Henderson nodded, but I could see he'd already begun thinking of me as someone planning his exit rather than someone committed to the agency's future. That night, I told Clara about the conversation. Her reaction was immediate and sharp. "They're pushing you out," she said flatly. "Not all at once, but gradually. Leo's positioning himself as your successor while making it seem like your idea." You think Leo's orchestrating this? I think Leo learned everything he needed to know from you, and now he's eliminating the competition. Competition. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought of Leo as competition. He was my student, my protege, the person I was training to eventually take over. But Clara was right. Leo had stopped being my student and started being my replacement. What should I do? Fight back. Make it clear that you're not going anywhere, that you're still a vital part of the agency's success. Don't let them write you out of your own story. But fighting back would require acknowledging that there was a battle happening, that Leo had been maneuvering against me for months while I'd been treating him as a trusted colleague. It would mean accepting that my protege had become my enemy. The next morning, I arrived at the office determined to reassert my authority and reclaim my position. But Leo was already there, meeting with Henderson in the conference room I'd used for client presentations for 15 years. Through the glass walls, I could see them reviewing documents that looked like organizational charts and strategic planning materials. They looked up when I knocked on the door. "Arthur," Henderson said, "good timing. Leo and I were just discussing some structural changes that might benefit the creative department." Structural changes. The euphemism for everything that was about to destroy my career. What kind of structural changes? Leo gestured for me to sit down, but I remained standing. "We're looking at ways to optimize our creative leadership structure," he said, "making sure we have clear lines of authority and responsibility. The current structure seems to be working well. Our creative output is strong, clients are satisfied, and we're profitable." "All true," Henderson agreed. "But we're also growing, and growth requires evolution. Leo has some interesting ideas about how we can modernize our approach while honoring the foundation you've built." Honoring the foundation. Making me historical while they built the future. "I'd like to hear these ideas," I said. Leo opened a presentation on his laptop and turned the screen toward me. The organizational chart showed Morrison & Associates' creative department under new leadership structure. Leo Vance, Executive Creative Director. Below him, 3 senior creative directors responsible for different client categories. Arthur Sterling was listed as Creative Consultant, reporting to Leo but outside the main organizational hierarchy. "This structure gives us more flexibility and clearer accountability," Leo explained. "You'd have a consulting role that leverages your experience while giving you more autonomy to focus on the projects that interest you most." More autonomy. Code for less authority. Where did this proposal come from? I wasn't involved in any discussions about restructuring the creative department. "It came from our strategic planning sessions," Henderson said. "Leo's been working with an outside consultant to analyze our organizational effectiveness." An outside consultant. Leo had hired external help to justify my removal. "I'd like to see the consultant's full report," I said. Henderson and Leo exchanged glances. "Of course," Henderson said. "We'll get you a copy this afternoon." But I knew I'd never see that report, just like I'd never been included in the strategic planning sessions that led to this restructuring proposal. Leo had systematically excluded me from decisions about my own future while creating the appearance of collaborative leadership. That afternoon, I called a meeting with my entire creative team, 23 people who'd worked under my direction for years, who'd learned from my methodologies, who'd contributed to the success that Leo was now claiming credit for. "I wanted to address some rumors about potential organizational changes," I began. "There are no plans to restructure the creative department. I remain your direct supervisor, and our reporting relationships haven't changed." But even as I spoke, I could see doubt in their faces. Janet, my assistant, looked uncomfortable. Mark, our senior art director, wouldn't meet my eyes. Several junior staff members seemed confused, as if they'd already heard different information from other sources. After the meeting, Mark approached me privately. "Arthur, Leo mentioned that you might be transitioning to a different role. He said we should start reporting creative decisions through him to ensure continuity." "When did Leo tell you this?" "Last week. He said it was part of a broader efficiency initiative." Last week, before Henderson had even presented the restructuring proposal to me, Leo was already implementing it with my staff. I spent the weekend reviewing every interaction I'd had with Leo over the past year, looking for patterns I'd missed, warning signs I'd ignored. The picture that emerged was of a systematic campaign to undermine my authority while positioning himself as my natural successor. But understanding Leo's strategy didn't give me tools to fight it. He'd been too careful, too subtle. Every move had been defensible, every explanation had been reasonable. He'd isolated me without appearing to attack me, marginalized me while expressing respect for my contributions. Monday morning, I arrived at the office to find a meeting scheduled between Henderson, Leo, and myself. The subject line was Organizational Transition Discussion. I knew before entering the conference room that this would be my last week at Morrison & Associates. "Arthur," Henderson began, "we've been thinking about your feedback on the restructuring proposal. While we value your commitment to the agency, we think the consulting role might actually be better aligned with your long-term interests." My long-term interests, as if they had any idea what my interests were. The consulting arrangement would give you more flexibility, better work-life balance, and the opportunity to focus on high-level creative strategy rather than day-to-day management, Leo added. Better work-life balance. The suggestion that I wanted to work less, achieve less, matter less. What if I'm not interested in a consulting role? What if I want to maintain my current position? Henderson and Leo exchanged the same glance I'd seen repeatedly over the past month. "Arthur," Henderson said carefully, "we need leadership that's fully committed to the agency's growth trajectory. If you're not interested in evolving with our changing needs, we might need to consider other options." Other options. The threat was clear. "I see," I said quietly. "And what would these other options involve?" "A generous severance package," Henderson replied. "Recognition of your contributions, strong references, and transition time to explore new opportunities." New opportunities. At 55, in an industry that worshipped youth and innovation. I looked at Leo, this man I'd mentored for 5 years, this protege I'd treated like a son. His expression was sympathetic but determined. He wasn't gloating about his victory, but he wasn't apologetic either. This was business, not personal. Strategic, not emotional. "When would you need a decision?" "Take your time," Henderson said. "But we'd like to finalize the new structure by the end of the month." The end of the month. 2 weeks to accept my exile or face termination. That night I told Clara about the ultimatum. She listened without interruption, her face growing more angry with each detail. 30 years, she said when I finished. 30 years of loyalty, and they're giving you 2 weeks to accept humiliation or face termination. Maybe the consulting role wouldn't be so bad. I'd still be involved, still contributing. "Arthur, don't you see what's happening? Leo didn't just steal your position, he stole your dignity. He made you grateful for scraps from the table you built." She was right. The consulting role wasn't a compromise. It was surrender disguised as accommodation. What do you think I should do? "I think you should remind them exactly what they're losing." But I wasn't sure how to do that without seeming desperate or vindictive. Leo had played the long game perfectly, creating a situation where any resistance on my part would look like an older employee unable to accept change. The answer came to me Tuesday morning when I received a call from Richard Thompson, creative director at Pinnacle Creative, one of Portland's largest advertising agencies. "Arthur," Richard said, "I heard through the grapevine that you might be exploring new opportunities. Are the rumors true?" The grapevine. Leo had already started spreading word that I was leaving Morrison & Associates voluntarily, getting ahead of any narrative that might make him look bad. "There have been some organizational changes," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because we've been looking for someone with your experience to head up our new strategic consulting division. Senior-level position, equity participation, full creative authority. Interested in having a conversation?" Equity participation, full creative authority. Everything Morrison & Associates was taking away from me. I'd be very interested in that conversation. We met that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, away from industry eyes and agency politics. Richard laid out an opportunity that was everything I'd hoped for but never expected to find. Pinnacle is expanding into strategic consulting for Fortune 500 companies, he explained. We need someone who can speak their language, understand their challenges, and develop long-term creative partnerships. Your reputation and experience make you perfect for this role. What about the competition with Morrison & Associates? What about it? You'd be building something new, not competing directly with your old agency. Besides, Leo Vance might be talented, but he doesn't have 30 years of client relationships and industry credibility. That afternoon, I drafted my resignation letter. Not because Henderson and Leo had forced me out, but because I'd found something better. Something that valued my experience instead of treating it as an obstacle. I delivered the letter Thursday morning, walking into Henderson's office with Leo already present for what they probably thought would be another negotiation session. "Gentlemen," I said, placing the letter on Henderson's desk, "I wanted to let you know that I'm resigning from Morrison & Associates, effective immediately." Henderson opened the letter, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. "Arthur, this is very sudden. We thought you were considering the consulting arrangement." "I was, but I received a better offer. Pinnacle Creative has asked me to head their new strategic consulting division. Equity participation, full creative authority, opportunity to build something from scratch." Leo's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. "Pinnacle? They're one of our biggest competitors." "They were. Now they're my new employer." For the first time since I'd known him, Leo looked genuinely rattled. The student had become the master, but the master had just joined the enemy. "Arthur," Henderson said, "let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work out an arrangement that addresses your concerns." "My concerns have been addressed. Richard Thompson values experience, understands the importance of institutional knowledge, and believes that 30 years of success should be rewarded rather than discarded." I stood up and shook Henderson's hand. "Thank you for the opportunities you've given me over the years. I hope the restructuring works out as planned." Leo remained seated, staring at the resignation letter as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. His carefully orchestrated coup had succeeded, but his victory had created a new problem. Arthur Sterling wasn't disappearing quietly into retirement. He was joining the competition with 30 years of Morrison & Associates secrets, client relationships, and strategic knowledge. "Arthur," Leo said as I reached the door, "I hope there are no hard feelings about the restructuring. It was never personal." I turned back to face him, this man I'd trained to replace me, this protégé who'd manipulated his way into my position. "No, Leo," I said quietly. "It wasn't personal, it was just business. And now you'll learn what it means when someone with 30 years of experience decides to compete with you instead of mentoring you." 6 months later, Leo Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, my former office, watching the Willamette River flow past while his carefully constructed empire crumbled around him. The first blow came 3 weeks after my departure. Cascade Electronics, Morrison & Associates' second-largest client, called an emergency meeting. I wasn't there, of course, but Janet, who'd remained loyal despite Leo's attempts to win her over, filled me in on the details later. "Mr. Vance," the Cascade CEO had said, "we're concerned about the strategic direction of our account. The campaigns you've proposed feel unfocused. Where's the psychological insight that made our previous work so effective?" Leo had scrambled to explain his vision, but without the foundational understanding I'd spent years developing, his ideas lacked depth. The sophisticated consumer psychology that had made Cascade's campaigns successful wasn't something he could fake or reverse engineer from old presentations. "We're going to pause new initiatives," Cascade announced, "until we can reassess our marketing strategy." 2 weeks later, they signed with Pinnacle Creative. The second blow was more personal. During a Portland Advertising Council meeting, one of those industry events Leo had been attending in my place, Richard Thompson introduced me as Pinnacle's new strategic consulting director. The room buzzed with surprise and curiosity. Arthur Sterling, after 30 years at Morrison & Associates, had made a move. But the real surprise came when I announced Pinnacle's new client acquisition, Meridian Corporation. Arthur, the Meridian CEO explained to the room, built the campaign that transformed our brand identity. When we heard he was available for new partnerships, the decision was obvious. I watched Leo's face across the room as the implications hit him. Meridian wasn't just any client. It was the crown jewel of his portfolio, the campaign that had made his reputation, and they'd followed me to Pinnacle without hesitation. But I wasn't finished. The third blow came from an unexpected source, the talent I'd trained over the years at Morrison & Associates. Mark, the senior art director who'd looked so uncomfortable during my final team meeting, called me on a Tuesday evening. "Arthur," he said, "I need to ask you something. Leo's been making changes to our creative processes, and honestly, they're not working. Client satisfaction is down, internal morale is suffering, and I'm starting to think he doesn't really understand the methodologies you taught us." "What kind of changes?" "He's abandoned the consumer psychology frameworks you developed. Says they're outdated approaches that don't reflect modern consumer behavior. But the campaigns we're producing feel shallow, like they're chasing trends instead of addressing real human needs." Within a month, 3 of Morrison & Associates' best creative staff had submitted resignations. All 3 mentioned better opportunities at other agencies. Opportunities that, coincidentally, had come through recommendations from former colleagues now working with me at Pinnacle. Leo tried to stem the bleeding by offering salary increases and promotion opportunities, but money couldn't replace the institutional knowledge that was walking out the door. The creative methodologies I'd spent decades developing weren't written in manuals or documented in presentations. They existed in the minds of people who'd learned them through experience and practice. The fourth blow was the most devastating because it came from Henderson himself. "Leo," Henderson said during what would be their final quarterly review, "I'm concerned about our client retention numbers. We've lost 3 major accounts in 6 months, and several others have expressed dissatisfaction with our recent work." "It's a transitional period," Leo replied, his confidence finally showing cracks. "We're implementing new creative strategies that will pay dividends in the long term. New creative strategies that our clients don't seem to appreciate. The Hartley Group specifically mentioned that our recent campaigns lack the strategic depth they've come to expect from Morrison & Associates." The Hartley Group, another client who'd worked with me for over a decade, who understood the difference between clever advertising and strategic communication. "I can address their concerns," Leo said. "Schedule a meeting, and I'll personally review their objectives and realign our approach." But Henderson had already made his decision. The next morning he called me directly. "Arthur," he said, "I think I made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind that's going to cost me my agency if I don't fix it quickly. Leo's talented, but he's not you. He learned your techniques, but he didn't inherit your wisdom. There's a difference between knowing the right answers and understanding why they're right." "What are you asking, Henderson?" "I'm asking if you'd consider coming back. Executive Creative Director, full authority, equity participation. Leo would report to you as Senior Creative Director, working under your guidance until he develops the experience to lead effectively." I let the silence stretch for a long moment, savoring the irony. 6 months ago, Henderson had been ready to push me out to make room for Leo's fresh energy. Now he was begging me to return to clean up the mess that fresh energy had created. "I appreciate the offer," I said finally, "but I'm very happy at Pinnacle. We're building something exciting here, and I have complete creative autonomy." "What would it take? Name your terms." "There are no terms, Henderson. You made your choice when you decided that 30 years of proven success was less valuable than Leo's potential. Now you get to live with the consequences." After I hung up, Clara found me in my home office, staring out at our garden with a satisfied smile. "Good news?" she asked. "Henderson wants me back. Apparently Leo's strategic vision isn't working out as planned." "And you told him?" "I told him that some lessons can only be learned through experience. Leo wanted to replace me before he understood what made me irreplaceable. Now he gets to discover the difference between technique and wisdom. The final blow came 3 months later, when Morrison and Associates announced that Leo Vance was pursuing new opportunities and would be leaving the agency. The press release praised his contributions and wished him well in his future endeavors, but industry insiders understood the truth. Leo had been fired. I heard through the grapevine that he'd accepted a position at a smaller agency in Seattle, far from the Portland market where his reputation had been built and subsequently destroyed. The student who'd tried to eliminate his teacher had learned a harsh lesson about the difference between ambition and wisdom. But my revenge wasn't complete until I received an unexpected visitor at Pinnacle's offices 6 months later. Leo Vance, looking older and more humble than I'd ever seen him, sat across from my desk in the same position he'd occupied during his interview at Morrison and Associates 7 years earlier. "Mr. Sterling," he said, and I noticed he'd returned to the formal address he'd used as my student. "I owe you an apology." "Do you?" "I thought I understood everything you'd taught me. I thought your experience was just accumulated knowledge that I could absorb and improve upon. I didn't realize that wisdom comes from making mistakes, facing consequences, and learning from failure." "And now you do?" "Now I understand that 30 years of success represents 30 years of problems solved, relationships built, and trust earned. You can't shortcut that process, and you can't steal it from someone else." I leaned back in my chair, studying this man who'd once been my greatest protégé and most dangerous enemy. "What do you want, Leo?" "I want to ask if you'd consider giving me another chance, not as your replacement, not as your equal, but as your student. I've learned the hard way that there's a difference between being clever and being wise." For a long moment I considered his request. Leo had cost me months of stress, forced me to leave an agency I'd helped build, and nearly destroyed my professional reputation. But he'd also taught me something valuable: that real success isn't just about what you achieve, but about how well you can defend it when challenged. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "But if I decide to give you another chance, it will be on very different terms than before." "I understand. And Mr. Sterling, thank you for teaching me the most important lesson of my career, which is that some things can't be taken. They have to be earned." As Leo left my office, I realized that my revenge was complete, not because I'd destroyed his career, but because I'd taught him the respect for experience that he should have learned years earlier. Sometimes the best revenge isn't crushing your enemies, it's turning them back into students. And sometimes the student who tries to replace his teacher learns that mastery isn't just about acquiring knowledge. It's about understanding the difference between information and wisdom, between technique and judgment, between ambition and character. Leo had learned that lesson the hard way. Now perhaps he was ready to learn it the right way.